Episode 9, Numbering the Nation. Dear Zippy with Love. December 1966. We're in Chicago's main post office, and there's a problem.
A big problem.
A 10 million pieces of mail problem.
Oh my God, 10 million pieces? And this is December, so, it isn't junk mail. It's like Christmas gifts, draft notices, paychecks, letters from sons in Vietnam, the most emotionally loaded mail month of the year.
And it's just sitting there, piling up. The sorting facility looks like someone upended every mailbox in Illinois into one giant room. There are letters everywhere, packages stacked to the ceiling, and nobody can figure out how to make it move.
How does that even happen? Isn't the whole point of the post office to move mail?
Right? The system that had worked for over a century. This incredibly sophisticated network of human expertise was literally collapsing under its own success. Mail volume had doubled in the last 20 years. More people, more addresses, and more stuff to deliver.
And according to rumors at the time, officials were seriously considering just burning it.
Burning 10 million pieces of mail just to reset the system. It's like when your computer freezes and you just hold down the power button, except it's people's Christmas cards and bills and love letters.
The problem was actually really simple. Hiring more workers meant training more workers to memorize more addresses. And that process took years. You couldn't just throw bodies at this problem because the knowledge lived in the workers' heads.
And 3 years earlier, in July 1963, the post office had rolled out a solution. 5 digits. They promised it would make everything faster, more efficient, and more modern.
Zip codes. And they were correct. It did solve the problem, but not in the way that anyone expected. Because it wasn't really about making mail faster.
No, it was about making workers replaceable. I'm Aileen Day.
And I'm Maia Warner-Langenbahn. And this is People of Agency,
a podcast about the U.S. Postal Service, public institutions, and the ordinary people who built them, broke them, and fought like hell to make them work for everyone.
Today, the story of how 5 little numbers changed who had power in America, and why we're still fighting about it 60 years later.
Act 1. The Memory Palace. Okay, before we talk about zip code changes, we need to understand what came before them. Because the pre-zip mailing sorting system was genuinely incredible.
And we mean that in 2 ways. Incredible as in impressive, and incredible as in, I cannot believe human beings actually did this. Because remember back in episode 2, Westward Bound, when we talked about railway mail service clerks working on moving trains? Sorting mail at 80 miles an hour while the tracks rumbled beneath them?
What we didn't have time to fully explore then was just how sophisticated that knowledge system actually was. These clerks had to memorize up to 30,000 addresses. One veteran clerk's daughter said that her father had memorized every single address in Boston, the whole city.
30,000 addresses? I mean, I can't remember my partner's phone number half the time, and 30,000 addresses seems crazy. And this wasn't just casual knowledge that you pick up.
Not at all. Every 6 months, you took a scheme examination. They'd give you a stack of cards with addresses, and you had to sort them into correct routing slots from memory with 97 to 99% accuracy. If you failed, you were out. Your entire career depended on building and maintaining this massive mental map. Your brain was literally the database.
And I mean, hopefully you don't get test anxiety. But here's what I'm wondering, because in episode 6, we talked about trains getting slower and airmail being added. So by the 1960s, were railway mail service clerks even that central to the system anymore?
Surprisingly, yes. By 1960, railway mail service was still handling a huge portion of the mail. Thousands of clerks on trains across the country every day. Yes, airmail was growing, especially for long distances, but whether mail was sorted on a train, in a plane, or at a stationary facility, it all relied on the same scheme knowledge system, powered by people.
So the bottleneck wasn't actually the trains, it was the knowledge.
That's it. And picture a sorting room. It's this constant symphony of movement and sound, letters shuffling, that rhythmic slap, slap, slap when envelopes hit wooden cubbyholes, canvas mailbags dragging across the concrete floors, the snap of twine as bundles get tied.
And I mean, I love that sound. The skilled sorters could do 60 letters per minute, right? Like one every single second.
Yeah, but only if you've been trained for years. And that's if that person's handwriting was legible. If someone's handwriting was terrible, like completely illegible,
Oh my God, this is one of my favorite stories. In the late 1800s, the New York Post Office had an elite department called the Bureau of Hards. Harper's Magazine called them, quote, Arachnologists of ink, like spider experts, but for deciphering terrible handwriting. And that's an incredible job title. Like, someone asks you, what do? You get to say, I'm an arachnologist of ink.
truly iconic. And there's this famous case from 1871. A letter addressed only 30 miles from New York City took 4 days to get there because no one could read the address. Regional clerks kept passing it along like, I can't figure this out, maybe you can. Finally, it reached the chief of the Bureau of Hards, who spent an entire day studying this envelope before he deciphered it.
An entire day for one letter. I mean, that's what I mean about expertise. That level of specialized knowledge, knowing not just addresses, but also how to decode bad handwriting. That's not something you can train quickly, especially back in the day when everyone and their brother used cursive.
And unbelievably, we still have this today. There's a remote encoding center in Salt Lake City with 1,100 workers who handle the mail that optical character readers, meaning machines, can't process. The machines reject it, and humans have to key it in manually. So even 60 years after zip codes, even with all the automation, we still need human expertise for the hard cases.
I can hear my elementary handwriting teacher now. But the machines can't do everything.
They certainly can't. New clerks took 3 to 5 years to get fast enough and accurate enough to work efficiently. So if someone retired after 20 or 30 years, all that knowledge walked out the door with them.
Which is actually really good for workers, right? Because if you're one of maybe a dozen people who knows the entire Chicago scheme by heart, management has to take care of you because you have leverage. You can't just be replaced by someone off the street.
In terms of job security and leverage, this system was great for workers. But by the 1960s, it's hitting a wall. Mail volume in 1943 was about 33 billion pieces. And then by 1962, it had nearly doubled to 66.5 billion.
So obviously, you need more workers. But training more workers takes years, and you can't train them faster because the whole system depends on memorization that literally takes time to build.
It's like trying to scale artisan bread production. At some point, the craft itself is the bottleneck. And by 1966, the system is literally breaking down. Chicago's main post office has 10 million pieces of mail just sitting there, backlogged.
And officials were reportedly discussing whether to just burn it all and start over. Like literally burning it was on the table, which is the postal equivalent of, hey, have you tried turning it off and on again? Incredibly, they did not set 10 million pieces of mail on fire.
Good. But this is where things get interesting because bottlenecks reveal where power lives in a system. The bottleneck here is worker expertise, all that knowledge in people's heads. And management basically has two options.
Option one, invest in workers, pay them better, train more of them, and acknowledge that expertise is valuable.
Or option two, figure out how to make that expertise obsolete. Encode the knowledge into a system management controls. So workers become interchangeable instead of irreplaceable.
And I'm guessing they picked option 2, because this isn't really about making mail faster, it's about shifting power. The mail crisis was real, but how you solve a crisis tells you whose interests matter.
And they absolutely choose option 2. Enter 5 digits assigned to every address in America.
Zip codes.
Zip codes! But before we get into how they sold this to the public, and the publicity campaign was absolutely spectacular, we need to talk about who actually invented this thing, because it's not who you think.
There's always someone who gets written out of history.
And in this case, there are several someones. And one of them spent 19 years trying to get anyone to listen to him. His name was Robert Aron Moon, and you've definitely never heard of him.
But we have heard of zip codes. Act 2. The Forgotten Inventors. Okay, so Robert Orand Moon is a man who spent 19 years being ignored. So tell me about him.
Moon was a postal inspector in Philadelphia, and in 1944, right in the middle of World War II, he has an idea. What if, instead of making workers memorize 30,000 addresses, we just number the regions? Simple enough. But he submits his proposal and gets rejected. So he submits it again. Rejected. And he just keeps going for 19 years. 19 years of submitting variations of the same idea and hearing no.
That's dedication to the craft of like, I know this is going to be good. You have to listen to me. I mean, it's either complete persistence or complete stubbornness, depending on how you look at it, but probably both. But it does work eventually, right? Because we have zip codes today. So finally, in 1963, the post office is like, okay, fine. We'll use your 3-digit regional system. But that's all Moon gets credit for, just the first 3 digits. The ones that route mail to what they call sectional center facilities.
Which raises the obvious question. Zip codes has 5 digits. So who came up with the other 2? And this is where it gets a little more interesting. There's this other guy, Bentley Hahn, a postal inspector in Texas. And in 1953, 10 years before zip codes launch, he writes this report called Proposed Reorganization of the Field Postal Service.
Wow, that title really makes you want to keep reading. But this is actually the intellectual architecture for the whole zip code system. His papers are at the JFK Presidential Library, digitized, and you can read them online. So we know exactly what he designed.
We do, and what Hahn figured out was how to incorporate the existing postal zone numbers, those 2-digit local codes that big cities had been using since 1943, into a nationwide system. Those became digits 4 and 5. And he was there at the public announcement in 1962, delivering the technical explanation of how it all would work. But almost nobody remembers his name.
Of course not, which is a bummer because his work was brilliant. And then there's D. Jamison Kane, who actually named it Zone Improvement Plan, ZIP, ZIP. I never knew that that's what it stood for. I just thought it was like zip, zippy, Zippy-Dee-Doo-Dah, like fast mail.
It's an acronym, and Kane ran the public relations campaign. He's the one who secured the rights to use Zip-a-Dee-Doo-Dah from Disney for the marketing, which is bonkers, by the way. We'll get to the full marketing plan later, but Kane literally named the thing, ran the PR, got a Meritorious Service Award in 1967, and then basically vanished from history.
So who does get the credit? Because someone's name is in the history books.
And that's when we get to J. Edward Day, Postmaster General. Great last name for a postal guy, by the way. He championed the combined system, announced it publicly, and oversaw the July 1963 launch, and then resigned 1 month later. 1 month! He wrote a memoir called My Appointed Round, 929 Days as Postmaster General. He got all the credit and then he bounced.
It's so unfortunate, yet also predictable. The people who did the actual work, Moon submitting proposals for 19 years, Hahn designing the system, Kane naming it and marketing it, and then some other guy swoops in right at the end.
Moon knew he was building something that would fundamentally change the postal system. I'm picturing him in his Philadelphia office in the 1940s and 50s, submitting these proposals over and over. That scheme knowledge we talked about, he was helping encode it into 5 digits. His wife called herself Mrs. Zip. She got a gold necklace made with Zip on it. She was so proud of what he had done.
But ultimately, what he'd done was help management take power from workers. The expertise that once made his colleagues irreplaceable would become obsolete, though I don't think Moon saw it that way.
I really don't think he did. I think he genuinely believed he was making the system better, more efficient, able to handle more mail, which it did. The system did get more efficient, but efficiency is never neutral, and we should talk about how they decided to number these regions, because the logic tells you everything about what mattered.
Okay, hit me. Why does Ohio start with 4 and Colorado start with 8? Because I've literally never thought about that.
So the first digit represents one of 10 geographic regions, 0 through 9, organized east to west, but more specifically, they're following railroad routes. 0 is New England, Maine, Massachusetts, and then you move down the East Coast and westward across the country until you hit California at 9. And the fact that zip codes followed the rail routes tells you how prevalent rail mail still was in the 1960s.
Even though airmail was growing at this time?
Even though airmail was growing, the backbone of the system was still trains. The routes had been optimized over decades, so when they designed zip codes, they didn't redesign the whole network. They just encoded the existing railroad-based routing into numbers. Zip codes literally mapped onto train routes.
That's actually really cool, but these aren't following state lines at all. They're following mail transportation routes, period. Fort Campbell, that military base that straddles the Kentucky-Tennessee border, its zip code 42223. Works for both states because the mail processing doesn't care about state boundaries.
Oklahoma has zip codes processed through Amarillo, Texas. Parts of California have zip codes processed through Reno, Nevada. The system was designed around one question: where does it make sense to move mail? Not where does it make sense for communities or governments. They took the infrastructure that already worked and turned it into a numerical system, which was smart. Moon's original 3 digits got you into a sectional center facility, one of about 900 regional hubs. Then Hahn's 4th and 5th digits pinpointed the specific post office or delivery zone.
How many possible combinations is that? And here's what I'm wondering. If this was such a good idea, why did it take Moon 19 years to get anyone to listen?
100,000 possible combinations, though only about 41,000 are actually in use. And the reason it took so long? Because adopting the system meant admitting that workers' expertise, years of training, that scheme knowledge could be replaced by 5 digits anyone could read.
Management knew that if they implemented this, they'd need way fewer skilled workers because training could speed up. New clerks wouldn't need years to memorize addresses. They just need to read numbers. So existing workers must have resisted this. But by the time zip codes launched in 1963, wasn't the system already collapsing?
Yeah, that's the thing. The Chicago backup with 10 million pieces, that's 3 years after zip codes launch. It's not that zip codes were bad. They worked. They solved the volume problem. But the way management implemented them shifted power. Workers who once had leverage because of their expertise suddenly became more replaceable.
The system got more efficient, but efficiency isn't neutral. Someone always benefits more than others, and in this case, management got more control while workers lost leverage. Now we need to talk about how they sold this to the American public.
And I'm guessing Americans were not immediately on board with being assigned numbers.
They hated it. They thought it was Orwellian, a communist plot, dehumanizing, all of it. Were they wrong?
And that's what we're going to figure out.
Because the marketing campaign the post office launched to convince America to use zip codes was absolutely unhinged, but in the best possible way, in our opinions.
Act 3, Mr. Zip and the Numbers Racket. Okay, so zip codes officially launched in July 1963. 5 digits assigned to every address in America. Immediately, there's a problem.
No one knows what their zip code is. And more importantly, no one knows what their friends' and family's zip codes are. You want to mail a letter to your cousin in Louisiana? That's great, but what's her zip code? You have no idea, and she probably doesn't know either. And how are you going to ask her? By mail?
And it's not like you could just Google it then, something I always forget about doesn't exist. So, what did these people do?
So some people called the post office every time they wanted to mail something. Or they'd call their friends and family and be like, hey, what's your zip code? So the post office mailed out these booklets called Zip-a-List kits to every household with instructions. But a lot of people just kept addressing mail the old way and hoped that it would still get there.
This is when the post office realized they needed a massive marketing campaign. This wasn't like introducing a new stamp design. They were asking people to memorize 5 new digits and add them to every piece of mail they sent. And this is 1963, the same year as the March on Washington, a year before the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Public trust in institutions isn't exactly high in this moment.
And on top of that, you've got Vietnam ramping up and civil rights protests. People are already, rightfully, skeptical of the government telling them what to do. And here comes the post office saying, we're going to assign you a number and you need to use it for all of your mail. So the post office launched what might be the most aggressive federal marketing campaign in American history.
Enter Mr. Zip. And I have to say this up front, I love Mr. Zip. I think he's delightful. He's this little cartoon mail carrier with a tiny pointy hat, carrying a letter, and his image was absolutely everywhere.
But the absurd thing is, he wasn't created for the post office. Mr. Zip was originally designed by a guy named Harold Wilcox in the late 1950s for Chase Manhattan's Bank by Mail campaign. He was called Mr. P.O. Zone back then. Then AT&T acquired the rights and rebranded him for their area code campaign in the 1960s.
So AT&T used him for area codes and just donated him to the post office when they're done?
Yeah, so Mr. Zip is literally a hand-me-down corporate mascot who became the face of a federal program, which is kind of perfect for what we're talking about, corporations and government working together to, quote-unquote, improve efficiency.
I love Mr. Zip. I think he's cute. If you haven't seen him, please Google him right now. What a cutie. And the marketing campaign around Mr. Zip was enormous. And we do have to talk about the musical called Zip Code with the Swingin' Six.
Oh my God.
It is genuinely over the top. This was a 15-minute film with 5 original songs featuring caveman and historical figures and what the production notes call zany skits.
Cavemen explaining zip codes is absurd. And there's this whole storyline about a man from New York who's competing for a woman in Frisco Bay. His letters keep arriving too late, so local suitors swoop in. The moral of the story is, if he'd used zip codes, his letter would have arrived with space-age speed and he'd have gotten the girl. And this is a romantic tragedy about mail routing, which I absolutely love. The songs were specifically designed to address common anxieties, like people worried about their handwriting being illegible or that mail would get lost. And the whole thing has this aggressively optimistic folk pop vibe that's trying so hard to make you think zip codes are fun and cool. And I don't know about you, but I desperately want to see this film now.
Oh, and it's out there. And alongside this, you've got Ethel Merman recording Welcome to Mr. Zip Code to the tune of Zip-a-Dee-Doo-Dah. And my personal favorite, 4.5-foot tall plywood cutouts of Mr. Zip at post office that would play a 90-minute audio message if you pushed a button. 90 minutes. Who was standing in front of a post office listening to Mr. Zip talk for an hour and a half? I mean, maybe me, but nobody. But it shows you how desperate they were to get people to adopt this. They also did Miss Zip beauty pageants, which is incredibly weird and very 1960s. And as someone who's worked in communications and campaign design, I actually find this fascinating. What they're doing is try to make something bureaucratic and impersonal feel friendly and non-threatening.
And speaking of zip codes becoming this whole cultural thing, Smokey Bear got his own zip code. In 1964, Smokey Bear was assigned zip code 20252 because he was receiving 13,000 letters per week. 13,000. He was the only individual besides the president to have his own zip code. And that's how Maya learned that the president has his own zip code.
That's incredible. And Smokey's zip code was decommissioned for about a decade, and then they reinstated it for his 70th birthday. And there are other special zips. The White House is 20500, and there's a postal boat on the Detroit River called the J.W. Westcott 2 that has a zip code 48222. It's the only ship with its own postal designation.
I love that zip codes started as this bureaucratic necessity and became this whole cultural phenomenon where even a bear gets his own number. So, Mr. Zip is cute. Moral of the story. He's helpful. He's aligned with Smokey Bear and other beloved American characters. He's not Big Brother assigning you a number. He's your friendly neighborhood mail carrier making things easier. And by 1967, 80% of Americans recognized Mr. Zip. The campaign worked in terms of awareness, but adoption was a whole different story.
Because Americans were furious about zip codes. The Fairbanks Daily News Miner straight up predicted failure. They said, quote, "We'll wager it'll be abandoned," meaning the zip codes, "will be abandoned in a few months as someone's highly expensive bright idea."
The Los Angeles Times said zip codes were, quote, "one more step towards turning people into numbers." The numbers wizard should have pigeonholed and responded to subliminal remote control in plenty of time to beat Orwell's 1984 deadline, end quote. People genuinely thought this was dystopian.
And Art Butchwald, the columnist, absolutely nailed the labor issue. He wrote, "While you do the work of memorizing codes, they can lay off thousands of workers and use computers instead." That's some foreshadowing for modern day. He saw exactly what was happening.
But most people just thought it was invasive and unnecessary. One woman returned her Zip A-list kit with a note that said, quote, "The Pony Express would be more efficient," end quote. The Pony Express, which we talked about, it lasted like 18 months and didn't even carry everyday mail. But people were looking for any reason to reject this. Some genuinely believed it was a communist plot.
And then in September 1963, just 3 months after zip codes launched, Charles Schulz introduces a new character in the widely adored Peanuts cartoon. His name was 555-95472.
Sorry, the character's name is literally a zip code?
The character's full legal name is the zip code 555-95472, but his friends call him 5. There's a backstory here. In the comic strip, this character's father changed the entire family's names to numbers. Quote, "In protest of society's ever-growing trend of reducing human lives to statistics," end quote. So the kid is stuck with a zip code for a name because Charles Schulz was protesting.
95472 is Schulz's actual zip code in Sebastopol, California. And this character has twin sisters named 3 and 4. They're the ones who do that bouncy dance in A Charlie Brown Christmas.
Those are the zip code protest kids?
Those are the zip code protest kids. And Schulz kept this character in the strip until 1983. 20 years of subtle protest, which shows you how deep the opposition went. This wasn't fringe conspiracy theorists. This was a mainstream skepticism.
So how long did it take for people to actually start using zip codes? In 1966, 3 years after launch, only 50% of Americans were using them regularly. By 1969, it was up to 80%. But it took until about 1978, 15 years after launch, to get near universal adoption.
15 years, so this was not by any means an instant success story. People resisted for over a decade. And while Americans were arguing about whether zip codes were Orwellian, something else happened behind the scenes.
Zip codes were already incredibly helpful for human sorters, since they simplified routing decisions. But this system also had to allow machines to read and sort mail. And those machines changed everything. Act 4. Your zip code knows too much.
Okay, so zip codes start as this routing system. 5 digits that basically just tell the post office where to send your mail. It's just geography, right? Totally neutral.
And for what they were designed to do, they actually work really well. The mail volume crisis we talked about, zip codes solved that. They allowed the postal system to scale in a way that couldn't have otherwise. By the 1970s and 80s, the system was handling way more mail than it did in the 1960s, which is pretty impressive considering how much Americans resisted zip codes at first and how much money the post office spent to get people to trust and then use them.
Totally. Like just 15 years earlier, Disney partnerships, 90-minute Mr. Zip speeches from a cardboard cutout. But eventually, people adopted the system and started using their zip codes. The mail got faster and the system scaled. So, yes, zip codes did their job. The problem is what happens next, because they don't stay just a routing system.
They absolutely don't. By the 1970s and 80s, marketers figured out something interesting. If you know someone's zip code, you can predict a lot about them: income, education level, whether they own or rent, what kind of car they drive, what they buy. And there was this system called PRIZM, Potential Rating Index for zip markets, that linked over 40,000 data points into individual zip codes. And PRIZM didn't just collect data, it categorized the entire American population into 62 distinct lifestyle clusters with these incredibly specific names. There was blue blood estates for the wealthiest neighborhoods, established executives, old money. There was money and brains for white collar professionals who read Architectural Digest.
These names are absolutely bizarre, and I would absolutely have loved to be in the boardroom where they were all suggested.
There was kids in cul-de-sacs for upscale suburban families. And then you get down to shotguns and pickups for young working class families, often living in mobile homes. And the system would predict that people in shotguns and pickups zip codes were statistically more likely to own hunting rifles, drive pickups, hence the name, own a horse, and order products from Mary Kay.
It's so specific, it's creepy, and it honestly sounds ahead of its time. And your zip code could and still can predict an enormous amount of your life. And businesses loved this because suddenly you could decide where to locate stores, who to send credit card offers to, all based on these clusters. It created what one researcher called a, quote, pecking order of affluence, end quote, that was literally mapped onto geography.
So you could target advertising with incredible precision. By 1986, there's a $135 billion direct marketing industry built on zip code targeting. But the people being categorized, the people living in shotguns and pickups or big city blues, they never agreed to be a part of this system.
So this is like the beginning of targeted advertising, because now we're so used to digital information and companies knowing everything about us online. But PRIZM was doing this before the internet?
Yeah, PRIZM was one of the first systems to do hyper-targeted marketing at scale.
Which is annoying, but not necessarily harmful. Like, I get more junk mail for things that I might actually want.
And that's what some people thought at first. But then other industries started using zip codes in ways that had much bigger consequences. Insurance companies, for example, were using zip codes to decide who got coverage and how much they paid. And in 1988, the Chicago Tribune ran this piece with the headline, "Mr. Zip has become Big Brother."
Because when racial redlining becomes illegal, insurance companies found a workaround. And we need to explain what redlining actually was because it's crucial to understanding this. Starting in the 1930s, the federal government, specifically the Home Owners Loan Corporation, created maps of cities and color-coded neighborhoods based on their quote-unquote desirability for lending. Green and blue were good investments, yellow was declining, and red was hazardous.
And the red zones were predominantly Black neighborhoods. But this wasn't just passive discrimination. It was an explicit federal policy designed to segregate. Banks wouldn't give mortgages in red zones. which meant Black families couldn't buy homes, couldn't build wealth, couldn't invest in their communities. And it just keeps getting more insidious because these neighborhoods got no investment. And then, because of that, they started to deteriorate, which then, quote unquote, justified the original red rating.
It's a purposeful and strategic, self fulfilling prophecy. You label an area as undesirable, you deny it resources, and then you point back to the lack of resources as proof that you were right to discriminate in the first place. And it gets worse, because in the 1950s and 60s, when cities started building interstate highways, guess which neighborhoods they plowed through?
The red line ones. It was called urban renewal, but it was really just urban removal. Entire Black neighborhoods were demolished just to make way for highways. So you've got no mortgages, no investment, and your neighborhood gets literally destroyed by infrastructure projects.
And all of this was legal until the Fair Housing Act in 1968. But insurance companies realized, okay, we can't legally discriminate based on race anymore, but we can legally discriminate based on zip codes. And if zip codes correlate with race,
Then you've just laundered discrimination through location data. The neighborhoods are already devastated from decades of disinvestment and highway construction. And now companies keep discriminating by pointing to zip codes instead of pointing to race.
they put that in writing. And this isn't just about whether you can get insurance, it's about cost. People living in predominantly minority zip codes pay, on average, 77% more for homeowners insurance than people in white zip codes with similar risk profiles.
For the same coverage, and it compounds. Because if you're paying more for insurance, you have less money for other things. Your credit score might suffer. And then credit companies can use your zip code to influence your interest rates. It becomes this strategic downward spiral.
And none of this is the zip code's fault per se. The zip code is just sitting there being 5 digits. It's what companies decide to do with the information the zip code provides to them.
Bingo. Zip codes didn't create segregation or discrimination. They encoded existing patterns, and then companies use them as a tool to reinforce those patterns. There's even research now showing correlations between zip codes and health outcomes. A 2019 study found that people living in historical redlined areas showed increased risk for preterm birth, cardiovascular disease, and all kind of health patterns.
But that's not because the zip code caused those health problems. It's because those neighborhoods were systematically denied resources and investment for decades. The zip code is just marking where that disinvestment happened.
The zip code is the marker, not the cause. Black adults living in segregated zip codes have a 12% greater risk of cardiovascular disease compared to Black adults in less segregated areas. That's because of environmental factors, access to healthcare, stress from discrimination, all the things that come from living in an area that's been systematically neglected. And 65% of those 1930 D grade neighborhoods remain low income today.
So the zip code encoded existing segregation, and then companies used them as a convenient way to continue discriminating without saying we're discriminating based on race.
Precisely. What started as a mail sorting system became a way to sort people into categories of deserving and undeserving. And when you put it that way, it sounds like what we're dealing with now with algorithms.
Oh, yeah, the algorithm is just efficiently reproducing existing inequality, and companies say, well, it's not our fault, the algorithm is neutral.
And hold on to that thought because we're going to get back into that. But first, Facebook.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. So, Facebook's ad platform lets advertisers target by zip code. And people were using it to exclude certain zip codes from seeing housing ads, employment ads, credit ads. You could literally say, show this job posting to everyone except people in these zip codes. And those zip codes just happen to be predominantly Black and Latino.
It's just discrimination with extra steps.
It is, and they got sued multiple times. In 2019, Facebook finally removed zip code targeting for housing, employment, and credit ads. Google did the same thing in 2020. So they knew it was being used to discriminate. I will say that digital ad targeting is also incredibly useful. I use it in my day job now. On a campaign I'm currently working for, implementing an alternative policing pilot program in 2 zip codes. We're able to target specifically those 2 zip codes in our marketing campaign, telling the communities that this resource is now available. So it's not all good or all bad, but people definitely are using this for bad.
Hmm. And here's the thing, those companies only changed their policies after years of lawsuits. The default was let it happen until someone forces us to stop, which is the same logic as the algorithm is neutral or we're just providing a platform.
Yes, nobody designed zip codes to be discriminatory. They were designed for mail efficiency, and they did that job well. But once you create a sorting system, people will use it to work in all kinds of ways. And the people getting sorted don't get a say in how the system works. They don't get to decide, actually, I don't want to be in this category, or this sorting mechanism is being used to harm me. And this is a pattern we keep seeing, right? A system gets created for one purpose, routing mail, connecting people online, whatever, and it works, it's useful. But then it gets repurposed in a way that reinforces existing power structures. And by the time people notice and start pushing back, the system is so embedded that changing it feels impossible.
Except people are pushing back. Communities are fighting for control over how they're categorized. And that brings us to the people who are fighting back. Act 5. The same fight, different decade.
Okay, we've spent this whole episode talking about how 5 digits changed everything. And here's what I keep thinking about: zip codes aren't good or bad. That's not a useful way to think about them.
Because zip codes solved a real problem. The mail volume crisis was real. Chicago really did have 10 million pieces of mail sitting there. The system needed to change. Zip codes worked, and they're still working 60 years later.
But working is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Because the question isn't whether zip codes function, they clearly do. The question is, who gets to decide what they're used for and who benefits?
Which is the question for any system, any tool, any institution. It's not about the tool being inherently good or bad, it's about who controls it. Zip codes solved the mail crisis, but the solution that got chosen was one that shifted power from workers to management.
Workers had leverage because their expertise was irreplaceable. Zip codes made that expertise obsolete. And then, once zip codes existed, companies figured out that they could repurpose them for all kinds of things that had nothing to do with mail: targeting ads, discrimination in insurance, reinforcing segregation.
Nobody designed zip codes to do any of that. But once you create a powerful sorting system, people will use it to sort in all the ways that benefit them. And the people getting sorted, well, they don't get a say. So when we talk about AI today, we're watching the exact same pattern play out.
Think about what AI is doing right now. Amazon delivery drivers who spent years learning which apartment buzzers work, which gates lock at night, which customers are never home, all that expertise is being extracted into an algorithm, just like scheme knowledge got extracted into zip codes.
And then the algorithm tells them what to do, even when the algorithm is wrong. There's this guy, Stefan Normadin, 63-year-old Army veteran, delivered packages for Amazon in Phoenix for almost 4 years. One day, he gets an email. You're fired. An algorithm decided he wasn't meeting productivity standards, and no human reviewed his case.
He tried to appeal, sent messages to an automated system that responded with computer generated replies. He even tried emailing Jeff Bezos directly and got a form letter back. Eventually, he gave up and started a small engine repair business. And here's what he said: it seems like they don't have any common sense about how the real world works.
Because the real world has context. The GPS is wrong sometimes, like when Michael Scott drove into that lake, or having the context of the roads being icy or the Amazon locker malfunctioning. But the algorithm doesn't care, it just sees numbers and statistics. And this is exactly what happened with zip codes. Human expertise and context got replaced by a system that only sees categories.
We'll keep having new technology, but expertise will never go away. Remember those 1,100 workers in Salt Lake City we talked about? Those ones manually processing mail that machines can't read? They work from an elevated platform that employees nicknamed air traffic control, where managers monitor their screen in real time, tracking every keystroke, every second of productivity.
So the expertise is still absolutely necessary. The machines can't do all that. But now the workers who have that expertise are under constant surveillance.
That's the shift. In the railway mail service era, if you had scheme knowledge, you had power. Management needed you. Now, the knowledge is still needed. The system literally can't function without these workers. But they've been stripped of any leverage. Their expertise is monitored, measured, and managed by algorithms that track every move.
So it's not that automation replaced human expertise, it's that automation changed who has power over that expertise.
And this is important. Automation isn't inherently bad. The postal system needed it to scale. Those 1,100 workers in Salt Lake City are more productive with optical character readers than they would be without it. The technology itself isn't the problem.
The problem is who controls it and what they optimize for. Because you could use automation to make workers' jobs easier, safer, less repetitive, and you could use it to reduce hours while keeping pay the same, but that's not what happens.
That's not what happens because the people making decisions about automation are optimizing for profit. Every penny squeezed from labor is a penny that goes to shareholders. So automation gets deployed in ways that speed up work, intensify surveillance, risk safety, and eliminate jobs. Not because that's what automation has to do, but because that's what serves the bottom line.
It's the same choice we saw with zip codes. The mail volume crisis was real, automation was needed, but management chose a solution that shifted power away from workers. They could have chosen differently.
They could have invested in workers while also modernizing the system. They could have said, we're going to use this technology to support expertise, not replace it. But that would cost more and give workers more leverage. And companies are using the same language they used in the 1960s: efficiency, progress, innovation. Amazon has cameras in delivery vans now that record 100% of the time and flag 16 types of violations like speeding, hard braking, and distracted driving, which can be triggered by scratching your face. One driver said it feels like prison.
And all that surveillance is feeding into productivity metrics. Amazon warehouses track every movement. Workers are expected to complete tasks every 6 to 9 seconds. Computer vision cameras watch everything. There was a Senate investigation that found injury rates at Amazon warehouses are 31% higher than industry average. During Prime Day 2019, it hit over 10 injuries per 100 workers.
And Amazon's own internal research found a direct connection between speed requirements and injuries. The internal research body recommended changes. Amazon said no because of productivity. They said efficiency matters more than worker safety.
And there's an economist at MIT, Darren Acemoglu, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2024. He's been writing about this exact issue. He calls it, quote unquote, so-so technology, innovations that displace workers without meaningful productivity gains.
Like self-checkout kiosks at grocery stores. They don't make checkout faster, they just shift the work from employees to customers. It's a labor shifting device, not a productivity increasing device. And Acemoglu argues that this is what AI is doing: automating tasks in ways that replace people but don't actually improve outcomes. Since 1980, automation has reduced wages for men without a high school degree by almost 9%.
So, who benefits? Shareholders, management, the people who own the technology. Microsoft laid off 6,000 workers while their CEO announced that 30% of their code is now AI written. Amazon announced 14,000 corporate job cuts and explicitly connected it to AI efficiency. The pattern is introduce AI, cut workers, profits go up.
And it's the same pattern we saw with zip codes. Introduce mechanization, reduce workers, efficiency goes up. But efficiency for who? That's always the question.
But now workers are fighting back in new ways. The Writers Guild went on strike for 148 days in 2023 and won provisions that AI cannot be considered a writer. SAG-AFTRA went on strike for 118 days and won protections against AI digital replicas. The Teamsters UPS contract has provisions that cameras cannot be the sole basis for discipline.
So unions are actually winning AI protections written into their contracts. This is different from the 1970s, when mechanization was happening and workers could fight for better wages and conditions, but they couldn't really negotiate about the technology itself. Now workers are saying, if you're going to bring AI into our workplace, we're going to get a say in how it's used.
The Amazon Labor Union, led by Chris Smalls, made history as the first successful union at any Amazon facility in the US. And one of their main issues? Surveillance and algorithmic management. Job security against automation is number one on their bargaining list. So the fight isn't over. But what's fascinating is that this fight has been going on in different forms for decades.
And the postal workers have often been at the center of it, which brings us to where we're going next. In March 1970, 200,000 postal workers abruptly walk off the job in the largest wildcat strike against the federal government in American history. The strike wasn't about zip codes or automation, it was about wages and working conditions. Mechanization was changing work, shifting the power, and workers decided that they'd had enough. Postal workers were making poverty wages. Federal employees couldn't afford to live on what the government paid them.
The strike lasted for 8 days. Eventually, Richard Nixon sent in the National Guard to sort mail in New York City, and they just couldn't do it. That failure proved what workers had been saying all along. You can't just replace human expertise with a system. And the fight we're watching happen right now with AI, postal workers have been fighting versions of this for 50 years, and they have a lot to teach us.
So, next time on People of Agency, March 1970, the mail stops moving, and postal workers learn what happens when you take on the federal government and win. Thank you for listening to People of Agency. The institutions are messy, the people in them are complicated, and the fight over who they serve has never ended.
If you appreciate what we're doing here, digging into uncomfortable complexity instead of easy answers, leave us a review. Please share this episode with a friend. It's the best way for people to find small podcasts like ours. Find us on social media at people_of_agency.
Thank you for your support, because telling honest history, that's how we build better institutions.
People of Agency is created and written by Aileen Day with additional writing by Maya Warner-Langenbahn. It is hosted by Aileen Day and Maya Warner-Langenbahn.
This episode was edited by the amazing Kelsey Ruppersberg Day. Our beautiful cover art is by Sam Woodring. We have extensive sources for all of our episode linked in the show notes. Thank you to the post office for being the post office and having an incredible story to tell. Support your local post office by using postal services regularly. Mail a birthday card. Send your long-distance friend a piece of mail just for fun. There's no feeling like getting a piece of personal mail.